Welcome back to another descent into the darkest corners of American history, where we uncover stories so disturbing they've been deliberately buried beneath layers of time and silence. Today, we journey to the Missouri Ozarks of 1874, to a place where hospitality took on a meaning so twisted that it would forever change how we understand the depths of human depravity. This is the story of the Forgotten Inn, where strangers paid for their supper with their own flesh. Before we begin this harrowing tale, I must warn you that what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the supposed civility of 19th century America. The events I'm about to describe are not fiction, though I wish they were. They are documented in court records, newspaper archives, and the testimonies of those brave enough to speak the unspeakable truth. In the autumn of 1874, the Missouri Ozarks were a wilderness within a wilderness. While the rest of America was rebuilding after the Civil War, these remote mountains remained largely untouched by civilization's march. The terrain was unforgiving, carved by ancient rivers into deep hollows and steep ridges that could hide secrets for generations. It was here, in a valley so remote it didn't appear on any map, that Jeremiah and Constance Blackwood established what they called the Wayward Traveler Inn. The inn itself was an imposing structure, built from local limestone and timber that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 3 stories tall, with narrow windows that peered out like suspicious eyes. It sat at the convergence of 3 old Indian trails that had been used for centuries by travelers crossing the mountains. The location was strategic, positioned where weary travelers would be most desperate for shelter, most vulnerable to whatever hospitality the Blackwoods chose to offer. Jeremiah Blackwood was a man whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from a room. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, he possessed the kind of physical dominance that made conversation unnecessary. His face was a map of hard living, scarred by what he claimed were encounters with wild animals, though those who looked closely might have wondered if the marks were made by claws or something far more sinister. His eyes, pale blue like winter ice, held to intelligence that was somehow more disturbing than ignorance would have been. Constance Blackwood was perhaps even more unsettling than her husband, though in entirely different ways. Where Jeremiah commanded through physical presence, Constance wielded a different kind of power. She was beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers are beautiful, with auburn hair that caught firelight like burnished copper, and green eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Her voice was melodious, almost hypnotic, and she had a way of making even the most suspicious traveler feel welcomed, wanted, special. The couple had arrived in the Ozarks in the spring of 1871, purchasing the land from a Cherokee family who seemed eager to leave despite having lived there for generations. Local settlers, few as they were, whispered that the Cherokee had spoken of bad spirits in the valley, of ground that was hungry for blood. But Jeremiah paid in gold coins, and in 1871, gold spoke louder than superstition. The construction of the inn took nearly 2 years, with Jeremiah doing most of the work himself. He hired local men occasionally, but they never stayed long. Some complained of strange sounds coming from the basement during the night. Others spoke of finding bones while digging the foundation, bones that Jeremiah claimed were from ancient Indian burials, but which looked suspiciously fresh. One worker, a man named Samuel Creek, disappeared entirely after claiming he'd seen Jeremiah burying something large and wrapped in canvas behind the inn. His body was never found, though Jeremiah helpfully suggested that Creek had probably fallen into one of the many sinkholes that dotted the region. By the summer of 1873, the Wayward Traveler Inn was open for business. The Blackwoods advertised in newspapers as far away as St. Louis and Kansas City, promising weary travelers a respite from the dangers of the frontier. Their advertisements spoke of comfortable beds, hearty meals, and the kind of genuine hospitality that was becoming rare in an increasingly commercial world. What they didn't mention was the price of that hospitality, a price that would be paid not in coin, but in something far more precious. The first guests were a family from Illinois, the Hendersons, traveling west to start a new life in California. Thomas Henderson was a blacksmith by trade, traveling with his wife Mary and their 2 young children, 8-year-old Sarah and 10-year-old Michael. They arrived at the inn on a cold October evening in 1873, grateful to find shelter as the first snows of winter began to fall. According to the journal that would later be found hidden in the inn's walls, the Hendersons were everything the Blackwoods had been hoping for. They were isolated, traveling alone, and most importantly, they were not expected anywhere for several weeks. Thomas had written to his brother in California, but the letter wouldn't arrive for months, and even then, delays in travel were so common that no one would think to worry if the family was late in arriving. The Hendersons were welcomed with the kind of warmth that made them feel as though they'd found a home away from home. Constance fussed over the children, bringing them warm milk and fresh-baked cookies. Jeremiah regaled Thomas with stories of the frontier, sharing a bottle of whiskey that he claimed was aged in caves deep in the mountains. The inn's other guests, a traveling preacher named Reverend Josiah Crane and a merchant named William Polk, seemed like good company, and the evening passed pleasantly around the great stone fireplace in the inn's common room. But as the night wore on, Thomas Henderson began to feel strange. The whiskey, which had tasted fine at first, left an odd metallic aftertaste. His vision began to blur, and his limbs felt heavy. When he tried to stand, he found that his legs wouldn't support him. Across the room, he could see that his wife was experiencing the same symptoms, swaying in her chair as she tried to reach for their children. The last thing Thomas Henderson remembered was Constance Blackwood's beautiful face leaning over him, her green eyes bright with an excitement that had nothing to do with hospitality, her voice still melodious, but now carrying an undertone of something hungry, whispered words that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his short life. "Don't worry, Thomas. You're going to help us in ways you never imagined. Your family is going to become part of something much larger than themselves." When Thomas awoke, he found himself in what appeared to be a root cellar beneath the inn. The walls were carved from living rock, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and something else, something organic and rotting. He was chained to the wall by his wrists, the iron shackles cutting into his skin. In the dim light provided by a single oil lamp, he could see his wife and children in similar restraints along the opposite wall. They were alive but barely conscious, their heads lolling as they struggled against the effects of whatever drug they'd been given. The cellar was larger than it had any right to be, extending back into darkness beyond the reach of the lamplight. Along the walls, Thomas could make out what appeared to be other restraints, some of them stained with substances he didn't want to identify. The floor was covered with sawdust, but it couldn't entirely mask the dark stains beneath. This was not a place designed for storage. This was a place designed for something far more sinister. It was then that Thomas noticed the other occupants of the cellar. Reverend Crane and William Polk were there, chained like animals, but they were not alone. There were others, people Thomas had never seen before in various states of consciousness and health. Some appeared to have been there for weeks, their clothes torn and filthy, their faces gaunt with starvation. Others bore wounds that had been carefully tended, bandaged with clean cloth that suggested medical attention. The most disturbing sight was a man who appeared to be missing his left arm from the elbow down. The wound was old, healed over with scar tissue, but the man was still alive, still conscious. When he saw Thomas looking at him, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "They don't kill you all at once. They keep you alive. They take pieces." Before Thomas could process the full horror of what he'd heard, footsteps echoed from the stairs leading down to the cellar. Jeremiah Blackwood descended into the lamplight, but he was not alone. Behind him came Constance, and behind her, a figure that Thomas had not seen before, a man dressed in what appeared to be a doctor's coat, carrying a leather bag that clinked with the sound of metal instruments. The man in the doctor's coat was introduced as Dr. Mordecai Thorne, though Thomas would later learn that this was almost certainly not his real name. Dr. Thorne was a thin, nervous man with twitching hands and eyes that darted constantly around the room as if he expected to be attacked at any moment. His voice, when he spoke, carried the educated accent of the East Coast, but there was something broken in it, something that suggested a man who had fallen far from whatever respectable life he might once have lived. "Excellent specimens, Doctor," Thorne said, examining the Henderson family with the detached interest of a scientist studying insects. "The children especially. Young flesh heals so much better, and the flavor is incomparable. The woman will provide good breeding stock if we decide to expand the operation. And the man, well, he looks strong enough to last for months if we're careful about the portions." It was then that Thomas Henderson understood the true nature of the Wayward Traveller Inn. This was not simply a place where travelers were robbed and murdered. This was something far more systematic, far more horrifying. The Blackwoods, along with their associate Dr. Thorne, were operating what could only be described as a human farm, keeping their victims alive and harvesting them piece by piece for purposes that Thomas's mind refused to fully comprehend. The operation, as Thomas would learn over the following days, was both more complex and more horrifying than he could have imagined. The Blackwoods had been perfecting their system for nearly 2 years, learning through trial and error how to keep their victims alive for as long as possible, while extracting maximum value from each one. Dr. Thorne, who had apparently been stripped of his medical license in Boston for conducting unauthorized experiments on patients, provided the medical expertise necessary to ensure that the harvesting process didn't kill the victims too quickly. The process began with what Dr. Thorne called assessment. Each new arrival was examined thoroughly, their health evaluated, their potential yield calculated. The strongest and healthiest were designated for long-term harvesting, while those who were sick or weak were processed immediately. Children were particularly prized, not only for the supposed superior quality of their flesh, but also for their psychological effect on adult victims. Parents would endure almost anything to keep their children alive, making them exceptionally compliant. The harvesting itself was conducted with medical precision. Dr. Thorne had developed techniques for removing non-essential body parts while keeping the victim alive and relatively healthy. Fingers and toes were taken first, then hands and feet, then larger portions of arms and legs. The wounds were carefully cleaned and bandaged, and the victims were fed a diet designed to promote healing and maintain their strength. The goal was to keep each victim alive for as long as possible, extracting maximum value before they finally succumbed to blood loss, infection, or simply the psychological trauma of their situation. But the horror of the Wayward Traveller Inn extended beyond simple cannibalism. The Blackwoods and Dr. Thorne had developed what they believed to be a sophisticated business model. The flesh they harvested was not consumed immediately, but was instead preserved using techniques that Dr. Thorne had learned during his medical training. Some of it was smoked, some was salted, and some was prepared in ways that Thomas couldn't bear to think about. This preserved meat was then sold to customers who came to the inn specifically for this purpose. These customers were not random travelers, but were instead part of a network that the Blackwoods had carefully cultivated. They came from as far away as Chicago and New Orleans, wealthy individuals who had developed what they considered to be sophisticated tastes. They paid premium prices for what Dr. Thorne called exotic cuisine, believing that consuming human flesh would grant them some form of power or vitality. The Blackwoods had convinced them that the meat from their victims was somehow superior to ordinary food, imbued with the life force of those from whom it had been taken. The customers who came to partake of these meals were a cross-section of American society that would have shocked anyone who believed in the inherent goodness of their fellow citizens. There were businessmen from St. Louis who claimed that consuming human flesh gave them an edge in their financial dealings. There were politicians who believed it would grant them power over their constituents. There were even members of the clergy who had convinced themselves that they were participating in some form of communion, consuming the flesh of the innocent to purify their own souls. One of the most frequent customers was a man who called himself Colonel Bartholomew Ashford, though like Dr. Thorne, this was almost certainly an assumed name. Colonel Ashford claimed to be a veteran of the Civil War who had developed a taste for human flesh during the siege of Vicksburg, when starvation had driven soldiers to desperate measures. He spoke of the experience as though it had been a religious awakening, claiming that consuming the flesh of his enemies had given him strength and courage that no ordinary food could provide. Another regular customer was a woman who introduced herself as Madame Evangeline Rousseau, supposedly the widow of a French plantation owner who had fled Louisiana after the war. Madame Rousseau was perhaps the most disturbing of all the customers, as she specifically requested the flesh of children, claiming that it possessed healing properties that could restore her youth and beauty. She would arrive at the inn, dressed in elaborate gowns and jewelry, as though she were attending a dinner party rather than participating in acts of cannibalism. The most horrifying aspect of these customers was not their depravity, but their ordinariness. They were not wild-eyed madmen or obvious monsters. They were respectable members of society who had simply chosen to indulge in the ultimate taboo. They spoke of their cannibalism in the same terms that others might discuss fine wine or exotic cuisine, as though it were simply a matter of refined taste rather than moral horror. The Blackwoods had created an entire infrastructure to support their operation. They had established relationships with corrupt officials who ensured that missing persons reports were filed incorrectly or lost entirely. They had contacts among the criminal classes who could provide information about travelers who wouldn't be missed. They had even developed a system for disposing of the remains of their victims, feeding the bones and other unusable parts to a pack of wild hogs that they kept in a pen behind the inn. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the operation was its efficiency. The Blackwoods had turned murder and cannibalism into a business, complete with supply chains, customer relationships, and quality control. They kept detailed records of their victims, noting their physical characteristics, the quality of their flesh, and the prices they could command from different customers. They had developed standardized procedures for everything from the initial drugging of victims to the final disposal of their remains. Thomas Henderson witnessed all of this during his time in the cellar beneath the inn. He watched as other prisoners were taken upstairs for harvesting, some returning with fresh bandages and new wounds, others never returning at all. He listened to the conversations between the Blackwoods and Dr. Thorne as they planned their operations and discussed their customers. He saw the ledgers where they recorded their transactions, treating human lives as nothing more than inventory to be managed and sold. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical horror. The victims were kept alive not out of mercy, but for purely practical reasons, and they were constantly reminded of this fact. Dr. Thorne would visit the cellar regularly to check on his patients, as he called them, discussing their condition and their potential yield as though they were livestock. The Blackwoods would sometimes bring customers down to the cellar to select their meals personally, examining the prisoners like cuts of meat in a butcher shop. The children suffered the most, not only because they were physically weaker, but because they couldn't understand what was happening to them. Thomas watched his own children, Sarah and Michael, grow thinner and more frightened with each passing day. They cried constantly at first, but eventually they fell into a kind of catatonic state, staring blankly at the walls and responding only minimally to their parents' attempts to comfort them. Mary Henderson, Thomas's wife, began to show signs of severe psychological breakdown within the first week of their captivity. She would alternate between periods of hysteria, during which she would scream and struggle against her chains until her wrists bled, and periods of complete withdrawal, during which she would sit motionless and silent for hours at a time. Dr. Thorne observed these symptoms with scientific interest, making notes about the psychological effects of prolonged captivity and the anticipation of death. It was during one of Dr. Thorne's visits that Thomas learned the full extent of the operation's reach. The doctor spoke casually about other locations, other inns, and way stations where similar operations were being conducted. He mentioned names and places, suggesting that the Wayward Traveler Inn was not an isolated horror, but part of a larger network of cannibalistic enterprises spread across the frontier. According to Dr. Thorne, the network had been established by a group of individuals who had met during the Civil War, when the breakdown of normal society had allowed them to indulge in behaviors that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. They had discovered that there was a market for human flesh among certain segments of society, and they had decided to organize themselves to meet that demand. The frontier provided the perfect cover for their operations, as the lack of law enforcement and the constant movement of people made it easy for victims to disappear without investigation. The network operated like any other business, with suppliers, distributors, and customers. The inns and way stations served as both production facilities and retail outlets, while a network of agents in major cities helped to identify potential customers and arrange deliveries. The operation was so sophisticated that they had even developed different grades of product, with premium prices charged for the flesh of children, young women, and particularly healthy specimens. Dr. Thorne spoke with pride about his role in developing the medical techniques that made the operation possible. He had studied anatomy and physiology extensively, learning how to remove body parts without causing immediate death, how to prevent infection, and how to maintain the health of victims for extended periods. He had even experimented with different preservation methods, developing techniques for smoking, salting, and otherwise preparing human flesh for long-term storage and transport. The doctor's casual discussion of these horrors was perhaps more disturbing than the acts themselves. He spoke of his victims as though they were laboratory animals, discussing their responses to different procedures with the detached interest of a scientist. He seemed genuinely puzzled by their suffering, as though he couldn't understand why they didn't appreciate the contribution they were making to his research. As the weeks passed, Thomas Henderson began to understand that escape was not simply a matter of breaking his chains or overpowering his captors. The Blackwoods had created a system that was designed to prevent escape at every level. The inn was located in a remote valley with only one road leading in or out, and that road was carefully watched. The local population was sparse and largely under the influence of the Blackwoods, who had used a combination of bribery and intimidation to ensure their cooperation. Even if a prisoner managed to escape from the cellar, they would find themselves in hostile territory, with no allies and no resources. The nearest town was more than 50 miles away through treacherous mountain terrain, and the Blackwoods had spread stories about dangerous animals and hostile Indians to discourage anyone from venturing into the wilderness alone. They had also established relationships with local hunters and trappers who were paid to report any strangers they encountered in the mountains. The psychological conditioning of the prisoners was another barrier to escape. The constant threat of death, combined with the knowledge that any attempt at escape would result in the torture and murder of family members, created a state of learned helplessness that made resistance seem impossible. The prisoners were also kept in a state of physical weakness through controlled starvation and the stress of their situation, making it difficult for them to summon the strength necessary for escape. But perhaps the most effective barrier to escape was the simple fact that the outside world would not believe their story. The Blackwoods had cultivated a reputation as respectable innkeepers, and the idea that they were operating a cannibalistic enterprise would have seemed too fantastic for most people to accept. Even if a prisoner managed to reach the authorities, they would likely be dismissed as mentally disturbed or lying for some ulterior motive. It was this understanding that finally drove Thomas Henderson to attempt what seemed impossible. He realized that he and his family were going to die regardless of what he did, and that their only hope lay in exposing the Blackwoods operation to the outside world. But to do that, he would need to escape not just from the cellar, but from the entire valley, and he would need to bring evidence that would convince the authorities of the truth. The opportunity came during the 3rd week of their captivity, when a new group of prisoners was brought to the cellar. Among them was a man named Jacob Stern, a former Union Army scout who had been traveling through the mountains when he was captured by the Blackwoods. Stern was different from the other prisoners in that he had military training and experience in survival and escape techniques. More importantly, he had not yet been broken by the psychological conditioning that had rendered the other prisoners passive. Stern quickly assessed the situation and began to develop an escape plan. He had observed that Dr. Thorne's visits followed a regular schedule, and that there were brief periods when the cellar was left unguarded. He had also noticed that one of the oil lamps was positioned near a section of wall where the mortar between the stones had begun to crumble, possibly due to water damage from an underground spring. Working slowly and carefully over several days, Stern began to loosen the stones in that section of wall. He worked only during the periods when the cellar was unguarded, and he was careful to replace the loose stones before anyone came down to check on the prisoners. The work was painstaking and dangerous, as any noise might alert the guards, but Stern's military training had taught him patience and stealth. Thomas Henderson watched Stern's work with a mixture of hope and terror. He wanted desperately to believe that escape was possible, but he also knew that if they were caught, the consequences would be horrific, not just for them, but for all the prisoners. The Blackwoods had made it clear that any attempt at escape would result in immediate punishment for everyone in the cellar, and Thomas had seen enough of their cruelty to know that they would carry out their threats. But as the days passed and Stern continued to make progress, Thomas began to allow himself to hope. The former scout had managed to create a hole large enough for a person to crawl through, leading to what appeared to be a natural cave system behind the cellar wall. Stern had explored the cave briefly and reported that it seemed to extend back into the mountain, possibly connecting to other cave systems that might provide a route to the surface. The escape plan was simple but dangerous. Stern would go first, making his way through the cave system to find an exit, and then returning to guide the others. They would have to move quickly and quietly, as the guards would eventually notice their absence and raise the alarm. Once they reached the surface, they would have to make their way through the mountains to the nearest town, a journey that would take several days through hostile territory. The plan had obvious flaws. They didn't know if the cave system actually connected to the surface, or if it might lead them deeper into the mountain, where they would become lost and die of starvation or exposure. They didn't know how long they would have before their absence was discovered, or what resources they would find once they reached the surface. Most importantly, they didn't know if they would have the physical strength to make the journey, given their weakened condition from weeks of captivity. But despite these uncertainties, Thomas Henderson knew that they had to try. The alternative was to remain in the cellar until they were eventually harvested piece by piece, watching their children suffer the same fate. Even if the escape attempt failed, at least they would die fighting rather than submitting to the Blackwoods' horrors. The escape began on a cold November night, when the wind howling through the mountains would help to mask any sounds they might make. Stern went first, squeezing through the hole in the wall and disappearing into the darkness beyond. Thomas followed, then Mary, then the children, and finally the other prisoners who were still capable of movement. The man who had lost his arm was left behind, as he was too weak to make the journey, but he whispered a blessing as they departed, telling them to make their deaths count for something. The cave system was even more extensive than Stern had initially discovered. It wound through the mountain like a vast underground highway, with passages branching off in all directions. Some of the passages were large enough to walk upright, while others required them to crawl on their hands and knees through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. The air was cold and damp, and the darkness was so complete that they had to feel their way along the walls to avoid becoming lost. They traveled for what felt like hours, following Stern's lead as he navigated by instinct and military training. Several times they came to intersections where multiple passages branched off, and Stern would have to make quick decisions about which route to follow. There was no way to know if they were heading toward the surface or deeper into the mountain, and the constant fear of becoming lost added to the terror of being pursued. The children struggled the most with the journey. Sarah and Michael Henderson were weak from their captivity and terrified by the darkness and confined spaces. They had to be carried much of the way, which slowed their progress and exhausted the adults. Mary Henderson was in little better condition, as her psychological breakdown had left her disoriented and prone to panic attacks that threatened to give away their position. But somehow they continued, driven by desperation and the knowledge that capture would mean not just death, but prolonged torture. They climbed through vertical shafts, crawled through horizontal passages, and waded through underground streams that chilled them to the bone. Several times they heard sounds behind them that might have been pursuit, and they would freeze in terror until the sounds faded away. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity in the darkness, they saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. Stern had found an exit, a narrow opening in the mountainside that was partially concealed by fallen rocks and vegetation. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness of a November morning, gasping the cold mountain air and feeling the overwhelming relief of freedom. But their ordeal was far from over. They were somewhere high on the mountainside, with no clear idea of their location or the direction to the nearest town. They were dressed only in the clothes they had been wearing when they were captured, which provided little protection against the mountain cold. They had no food, no water, and no weapons to defend themselves against the wild animals that roamed the mountains. Stern took charge of the group, using his military training to assess their situation and plan their next moves. He determined their approximate location by the position of the stars and the lay of the land, and he set a course that he believed would take them toward the nearest settlement. But he also warned them that the journey would take several days, and that they would have to travel carefully to avoid being tracked by their pursuers. The Blackwoods would certainly have discovered their escape by now, and they would be organizing a pursuit. They knew the mountains better than the escapees, and they had resources and allies that the prisoners lacked. The only advantage the escapees had was their head start, and the possibility that the Blackwoods might not immediately discover which direction they had gone. The journey through the mountains was a nightmare of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. They traveled mostly at night to avoid being seen, hiding during the day in caves or dense vegetation. They found water in mountain streams, but food was scarce, limited to whatever berries or roots they could find. The children suffered terribly from the cold and hunger, and there were times when Thomas Henderson wondered if they would have been better off dying quickly in the cellar rather than slowly in the wilderness. On the second day of their journey, they encountered their first sign of pursuit. Stern spotted smoke from a campfire in the valley below them, and through careful observation, he was able to identify several men on horseback who appeared to be searching the area systematically. The escapees were forced to take a longer, more difficult route to avoid the searchers, which cost them precious time and energy. The psychological pressure was almost as difficult as the physical hardships. Every sound in the forest might be a pursuer, every shadow might hide an enemy. They jumped at the call of an owl or the crack of a branch, and they lived in constant fear that they would be recaptured and return to the horrors they had escaped. The knowledge of what awaited them if they were caught gave them strength to continue, but it also filled them with a terror that made rest almost impossible. On the third day, tragedy struck. Mary Henderson, who had been growing increasingly disoriented and unstable, suddenly broke away from the group and began running back toward the direction they had come from. She was screaming about needing to return to save the other prisoners, and her cries echoed through the mountains in a way that would certainly alert any pursuers to their location. Thomas Henderson and Jacob Stern pursued her, but she had a head start and the desperate strength of madness. They found her at the edge of a cliff, standing on the very brink and staring down into the abyss below. When Thomas approached her, she turned to him with eyes that no longer seemed to recognize him. "They're calling to me," she said, in a voice that was barely a whisper. "The children in the cellar. They're calling for their mothers. I have to go back. I have to help them." Thomas tried to reason with her, to bring her back from the edge, but it was too late. The horrors she had witnessed and the stress of the escape had finally broken her mind completely. With a smile that was more terrifying than any scream, she stepped backward off the cliff and disappeared into the darkness below. The loss of Mary Henderson was devastating to the group, both emotionally and practically. Thomas was consumed with grief and guilt, blaming himself for not protecting his wife better. The children were traumatized by witnessing their mother's death, and they became even more difficult to manage. Worst of all, Mary's screams had almost certainly alerted their pursuers to their general location, forcing them to change course again and lose more precious time. But Stern refused to let them give up. He reminded them that Mary's sacrifice would be meaningless if they didn't survive to tell their story to the authorities. He pushed them harder than ever, driving them through terrain that seemed impossible to traverse, always staying ahead of the pursuit that they could sense closing in behind them. On the fourth day, they finally saw signs of civilization. Smoke from chimneys rose in the distance, and they could make out the outline of buildings in a valley below them. It was the town of Cedar Falls, a small logging community that represented safety and the possibility of justice. But between them and the town lay several miles of open ground where they would be visible to anyone pursuing them. Stern made the decision to send Thomas Henderson ahead with the children while he remained behind to delay any pursuers. It was a desperate gamble, but their only chance of getting the story to the authorities before the Blackwoods could silence them permanently. Thomas protested, not wanting to leave the man who had saved their lives, but Stern insisted that the mission was more important than any individual. Thomas Henderson made the final approach to Cedar Falls, carrying his 2 children, who were barely conscious from exhaustion and exposure. He stumbled into the town's main street in broad daylight, a wild-eyed man in torn clothes carrying 2 half-dead children and babbling about cannibals and underground chambers. The townspeople's first instinct was to dismiss him as a madman, but something in his desperation convinced them to listen. The local sheriff, a man named William Garrett, was initially skeptical of Thomas Henderson's story. Tales of cannibalism and human farming seemed too fantastic to believe, especially when told by a man who was clearly suffering from severe trauma and exhaustion. But Henderson's knowledge of specific details about the Blackwoods and their operation, combined with his obvious physical condition and that of his children, gradually convinced Garrett that something terrible had indeed occurred. Sheriff Garrett organized a posse of 20 men, including several experienced trackers and hunters who knew the mountains well. They set out for the Wayward Traveler Inn within hours of Henderson's arrival, hoping to catch the Blackwoods before they could destroy evidence or escape. Henderson insisted on accompanying the posse despite his condition, as he was the only one who could guide them to the exact location of the inn. The journey back to the inn took 2 days, as the posse had to travel carefully to avoid alerting the Blackwoods to their approach. When they finally reached the valley where the inn was located, they found it apparently deserted. The building stood empty, with no smoke rising from its chimneys and no signs of life around the property. For a moment, Sheriff Garrett wondered if Henderson's story had been a delusion after all, but when they searched the building, they found evidence that confirmed Henderson's account in horrifying detail. The cellar beneath the inn was exactly as he had described it, complete with the chains, the bloodstains, and the hole in the wall where the prisoners had escaped. They found Dr. Thorne's medical instruments, still stained with blood, and his journals documenting the procedures he had performed on his victims. Most damning of all, they found the Blackwoods' business records, carefully maintained ledgers that documented their transactions with customers and their inventory of human victims. The record showed that the operation had been far more extensive than even Henderson had realized, with dozens of victims processed over the course of nearly 2 years. The ledgers included names, descriptions, and prices, treating human beings as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold. They also found evidence of the customers who had patronized the establishment. Letters from individuals arranging visits, payment records showing substantial sums changing hands, and even testimonials from satisfied customers praising the quality of the Blackwoods' offerings. The correspondence revealed a network of cannibalistic customers spread across several states, all connected by their shared appetite for human flesh, but the Blackwoods themselves were nowhere to be found. They had apparently fled when they discovered the escape, taking with them whatever portable wealth they had accumulated and leaving behind only the evidence of their crimes. A search of the property revealed the pen where they had kept the hogs that disposed of their victims' remains, and the animals were found to be unusually well fed and aggressive, attacking the searchers when they approached. The most horrifying discovery came when they excavated the area behind the inn, where Henderson had mentioned seeing Jeremiah Blackwood burying something. They found a mass grave containing the remains of more than 30 individuals, men, women, and children, who had been the victims of the Blackwoods operation. Many of the bodies showed evidence of the systematic harvesting that Henderson had described, with limbs and other body parts removed with surgical precision. Among the remains, they found evidence that helped to identify some of the victims. Personal effects, clothing, and in some cases dental work allowed them to match the bodies to missing persons reports from across the region. The victims came from all walks of life and all parts of the country, united only by their misfortune in seeking shelter at the Wayward Traveler Inn. The discovery of Jacob Stern's body was particularly tragic. The former Union scout had been found by the Blackwoods pursuit party and killed while trying to delay them long enough for Henderson and his children to escape. His body showed signs of torture, suggesting that the Blackwoods had tried to extract information about the other escapees before killing him. His sacrifice had not been in vain, but the knowledge of his fate added another layer of grief to an already overwhelming tragedy. The investigation that followed the discovery of the Wayward Traveler Inn became one of the largest criminal cases in Missouri history. Federal marshals were called in to coordinate the search for the Blackwoods and their associates, and investigators worked to trace the network of customers who had patronized their establishment. The case attracted national attention, with newspapers across the country reporting on the horrors that had been uncovered in the Missouri mountains. The search for the Blackwoods themselves proved frustrating and largely unsuccessful. They had apparently planned their escape carefully, establishing false identities and escape routes that allowed them to disappear into the vast American frontier. Sightings were reported from as far away as California and Texas, but none could be confirmed. It was as though they had simply vanished into the wilderness that had hidden their crimes for so long. Dr. Mordecai Thorne was eventually tracked down and arrested in New Orleans, where he had been attempting to establish a new practice under an assumed name. His capture led to additional revelations about the scope of the cannibalistic network, as he provided information about other locations and individuals involved in similar operations. His trial became a sensation, with newspapers reporting every gruesome detail of his testimony about the procedures he had performed on his victims. Thorne's trial revealed that the network of cannibalistic establishments was even more extensive than investigators had initially believed. There were similar operations in at least 6 other states, all connected by a loose association of individuals who shared both a taste for human flesh and the business acumen to profit from it. The network had its own supply chains, communication systems, and even a primitive form of quality control to ensure customer satisfaction. The customers who had patronized these establishments proved to be some of the most difficult aspects of the case to prosecute. Many were wealthy and influential individuals who used their resources and connections to avoid prosecution. Others had fled the country when news of the investigation broke, seeking refuge in places where American law could not reach them. Those who were arrested often received relatively light sentences, as the legal system struggled to deal with crimes that seemed to exist outside the normal categories of criminal behavior. The trial of Dr. Thorne lasted for 3 months and included testimony from Thomas Henderson and other survivors of the cannibalistic network. Henderson's testimony was particularly powerful, as he was able to provide first-hand accounts of the horrors he had witnessed and the systematic nature of the Blackwoods operation. His children, Sarah and Michael, were deemed too traumatized to testify, but their physical condition served as silent evidence of the abuse they had suffered. Dr. Thorne was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. His execution was carried out in the spring of 1876, nearly 2 years after the discovery of the Wayward Traveler Inn. Even on the gallows, he showed no remorse for his crimes, maintaining that his work had been in the service of scientific advancement and that his victims should have been honored to contribute to his research. The impact of the Wayward Traveler Inn case extended far beyond the immediate prosecution of those involved. It led to significant changes in how missing persons cases were investigated, particularly in frontier areas where law enforcement was sparse. It also resulted in new laws governing the operation of inns and boarding houses, requiring better record-keeping and more frequent inspections to prevent similar operations from going undetected. The case also had a profound impact on American society's understanding of the potential for evil that could exist within seemingly normal communities. The idea that respectable citizens could engage in cannibalism and human trafficking challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization and morality. It forced people to confront the possibility that monsters could hide behind facades of respectability and that the most horrific crimes could occur in the most ordinary places. For Thomas Henderson and his surviving children, the aftermath of their ordeal was almost as difficult as the experience itself. They struggled with trauma, survivor's guilt, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives after losing everything they had held dear. Thomas never fully recovered from the loss of his wife and the horrors he had witnessed, and he died just 5 years after the trial, some said, from a broken heart. Sarah and Michael Henderson were adopted by relatives and given new names to help them escape the notoriety of their experience. They grew up to live relatively normal lives, but they were forever marked by their childhood trauma. Neither ever spoke publicly about their experience again, and they took the full details of their suffering to their graves. The Wayward Traveler Inn itself was burned to the ground by local residents shortly after the investigation concluded. They wanted to erase all traces of the horror that had occurred there, to cleanse the land of the evil that had taken root in their community. The site was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the forest, becoming just another unmarked spot in the vast wilderness of the Missouri Ozarks. But the memory of what happened there has never been entirely erased. Local residents still speak in whispers about the inn, where strangers paid for their supper with their own flesh, and travelers through the region sometimes report feeling an inexplicable sense of dread when passing through certain valleys. The story has become part of the folklore of the Ozarks, a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind the facade of hospitality. The case of the Wayward Traveler Inn remains one of the most disturbing examples of organized cannibalism in American history. It demonstrates how isolation, desperation, and the breakdown of social norms can create conditions in which the most unthinkable crimes become possible. It also serves as a reminder that evil can take many forms, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal and respectable. The investigation into the cannibalistic network continued for years after the initial discovery, as law enforcement agencies worked to identify all the locations and individuals involved. They found evidence of similar operations in remote areas across the American frontier, from the mountains of Colorado to the swamps of Louisiana. Each discovery revealed new horrors and new victims, painting a picture of a criminal enterprise that was far more extensive and organized than anyone had initially imagined. One of the most disturbing aspects of the network was its sophistication. The operators had developed standardized procedures for everything from the selection of victims to the preparation and distribution of human flesh. They had established communication systems that allowed them to coordinate their activities across vast distances, and they had created a customer base that was both loyal and discreet. The customers themselves represented a cross-section of American society that challenged comfortable assumptions about who was capable of such depravity. They included businessmen, politicians, clergy members, and even law enforcement officials. Many were pillars of their communities, respected citizens who would never have been suspected of participating in cannibalistic activities. The psychological profiles of these individuals revealed common patterns that helped investigators understand how ordinary people could become involved in such extraordinary evil. Many had experienced trauma during the Civil War that had desensitized them to violence and death. Others had been influenced by pseudo-scientific theories about the supposed benefits of consuming human flesh. Still others seemed to be motivated by nothing more than a desire for novel experiences and the thrill of transgressing social taboos. The network had also developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. They operated in remote areas where law enforcement was minimal, and they cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who could be counted on to look the other way. They were careful to select victims who were unlikely to be missed, targeting travelers, immigrants, and others who existed on the margins of society. The preservation and distribution of human flesh required considerable expertise and resources. The operators had learned techniques for smoking, salting, and otherwise preparing meat for long-term storage and transport. They had established supply chains that could move their products across state lines without detection, often disguising human flesh as exotic game meat or other legitimate products. The financial aspects of the operation were equally sophisticated. The network generated substantial profits, with premium prices charged for different types of human flesh. Children's meat commanded the highest prices, followed by that of young women and healthy adult males. The operators had developed a complex pricing structure that took into account factors such as age, health, and even the circumstances of the victim's death. The money generated by these operations was used to fund expansion into new territories and to corrupt officials who might otherwise interfere with their activities. Some of the profits were also invested in legitimate businesses, allowing the operators to maintain respectable facades while continuing their criminal activities. The investigation revealed that the network had been operating for much longer than initially suspected. Evidence suggested that similar operations had been active during the Civil War, when the breakdown of normal society had provided cover for all manner of criminal activities. Some investigators believed that the network had its origins in the desperate conditions of wartime, when starvation had driven some individuals to cannibalism and they had discovered a taste for human flesh that persisted after the war ended. The scope of the network's activities was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that hundreds of victims had been processed through the various operations over the course of more than a decade. The true number would never be known, as many of the records had been destroyed and many of the victims had been people whose disappearances were never officially reported. The impact on the families of the victims was immeasurable. Many had spent years wondering what had happened to their missing loved ones, never imagining that they had fallen victim to such a horrific fate. The discovery of the network provided answers to some of these families, but the knowledge of what their relatives had suffered was often more painful than the uncertainty had been. The case also had a profound impact on American law enforcement, leading to the development of new investigative techniques and interagency cooperation protocols. The complexity and scope of the network had revealed the limitations of local law enforcement in dealing with crimes that crossed state and regional boundaries. This led to the expansion of federal law enforcement capabilities and the development of new approaches to investigating organized crime. The legal system also struggled to deal with the unprecedented nature of the crimes. Existing laws were inadequate to address the full scope of the network's activities, leading to the development of new statutes specifically targeting organized cannibalism and human trafficking. The trials of the network's operators also established important legal precedents regarding the prosecution of conspiracy cases and the use of circumstantial evidence in complex criminal cases. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond those directly involved. The revelation that such horrors could exist in civilized society challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the progress of civilization. It forced Americans to confront the possibility that the veneer of respectability could hide the most depraved impulses, and that the institutions they trusted to protect them might be infiltrated by those who sought to exploit them. The case also had a significant impact on American literature and popular culture. Writers and journalists struggled to find ways to describe horrors that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The story of the Wayward Traveler Inn became the subject of numerous books, articles, and eventually films, though most treatments focused more on the sensational aspects of the case than on its deeper implications. Religious leaders also grappled with the theological implications of the case. How could such evil exist in a world supposedly governed by divine providence? What did the existence of such depravity say about the nature of humanity and the possibility of redemption? These questions sparked debates that continued for years after the trials concluded. The scientific community was equally challenged by the case. Medical professionals struggled to understand how trained physicians like Dr. Thorne could have participated in such activities. Psychologists attempted to develop new theories to explain the motivations of both the operators and the customers. Anthropologists examined the case in the context of cannibalistic practices in other cultures, trying to understand how such behaviors could emerge in a supposedly civilized society. The case also raised important questions about the role of isolation and frontier conditions in enabling criminal behavior. The remote locations where the network operated had provided both the cover necessary for their activities and the victims they required. This led to discussions about the need for better law enforcement in frontier areas and the importance of maintaining social connections and oversight even in the most remote communities. The investigation into the network continued for more than a decade after the initial discovery, as new evidence continued to surface and new connections were uncovered. Some investigators became obsessed with the case, dedicating their entire careers to tracking down every lead and identifying every victim. The complexity and horror of the crimes seemed to demand nothing less than complete dedication to uncovering the truth. The final chapter of the Wayward Traveler Inn case came in 1885, more than 10 years after the initial discovery, when the remains of Jeremiah and Constance Blackwood were finally found in a remote canyon in Arizona Territory. They had apparently died in a confrontation with Apache warriors, their bodies left to the elements and scavengers. Even in death, they had found no peace, their bones scattered across the desert floor like the lives they had destroyed. The discovery of their remains brought a sense of closure to some of those who had been affected by their crimes, but it also raised new questions. How many other victims had they claimed during their years as fugitives? Had they attempted to establish new operations in the territories where they had fled? These questions would never be fully answered, but the knowledge that the Blackwoods were finally dead provided some measure of justice for their victims. The legacy of the Wayward Traveler Inn case continues to influence American law enforcement and criminal justice to this day. The investigative techniques developed during the case became standard practice for dealing with complex, multi-jurisdictional crimes. The legal precedents established during the trials continue to be cited in cases involving organized crime and conspiracy. The psychological insights gained from studying the case have informed our understanding of criminal behavior and the factors that can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case is the reminder it provides about the importance of vigilance and community responsibility. The horrors of the Wayward Traveler Inn were able to continue for so long, partly because people were willing to look the other way, to accept convenient explanations, rather than investigating uncomfortable truths. The case serves as a warning that evil can flourish when good people choose to remain silent, and that the price of such silence can be measured in human lives. The story of the Wayward Traveler Inn is ultimately a story about the capacity for both evil and heroism that exists within human nature. It shows us the depths to which people can sink when they abandon their moral compass, but it also shows us the courage and determination that can emerge when people are faced with unthinkable circumstances. The heroism of Jacob Stern, who sacrificed his life to save others, and the determination of Thomas Henderson, who risked everything to expose the truth, remind us that even in the darkest situations, there are those who will stand up for what is right. As we reflect on this dark chapter in American history, we must remember not only the horror of what occurred, but also the lessons it teaches us about the importance of protecting the vulnerable, questioning authority, and maintaining our moral courage in the face of evil. The victims of the Wayward Traveler Inn deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as human beings whose lives had value and meaning. Their suffering was not in vain if it serves to make us more vigilant, more compassionate, and more determined to prevent such horrors from occurring again. The inn where strangers paid for their supper with their own flesh is gone now, reclaimed by the forest and forgotten by most. But the memory of what happened there should never be forgotten, for it reminds us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, and that we must never become so comfortable in our assumptions about human nature that we fail to recognize the monsters that may be hiding among us. In the end, the story of the Wayward Traveler Inn is not just a tale of historical horror, but a warning for our own time. It reminds us that evil can take many forms, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal and respectable. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of things, to question what we are told, and to never stop fighting for justice and truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that fight may be. The forgotten inn in the Missouri Ozarks may be gone, but its legacy lives on in the lessons it teaches us about the human capacity for both evil and redemption. May we never forget those lessons, and may we never allow such horrors to occur again in our watch. The story of the Wayward Traveler Inn reached its final, chilling conclusion in the winter of 1887, 13 years after Thomas Henderson first stumbled into Cedar Falls with his traumatized children. By then, the case had become a cornerstone of American criminal law, cited in textbooks and studied by investigators across the nation. But it was a letter that arrived at the office of retired Sheriff William Garrett that would provide the most haunting epilogue to this tale of unimaginable horror. The letter was postmarked from a small town in Northern California, written in the shaky hand of an elderly woman who identified herself as Sister Mary Catherine of the Sisters of Mercy Convent in Redwood Falls. She had read about the Wayward Traveler Inn case in a newspaper and felt compelled to share information that had been weighing on her conscience for over a decade. Sister Mary Catherine wrote that in the spring of 1875, a year before the Blackwoods crimes were discovered, a woman had arrived at their convent seeking sanctuary. She was pregnant, clearly traumatized, and spoke with a refined accent that suggested education and breeding. She gave her name only as Margaret, refusing to provide any other details about her past or the circumstances that had brought her to their door. The woman had given birth to a daughter at the convent, but the child had been born with severe deformities that the local doctor attributed to malnutrition and trauma during pregnancy. More disturbing still, the infant had been born with what appeared to be bite marks on her tiny limbs, wounds that had healed but left permanent scars. The mother had looked upon her child with a mixture of love and revulsion that had deeply troubled the sisters. Margaret had remained at the convent for nearly 6 months, helping with the care of other children while slowly recovering her physical and mental health. But she had never spoken of her past, and the sisters had respected her privacy, assuming she was fleeing from an abusive husband or some other domestic tragedy. It was only when she disappeared one night, taking her infant daughter with her, that they realized something far more sinister might have been involved. The letter continued with details that made Sheriff Garrett's blood run cold. Sister Mary Catherine described how Margaret had sometimes been found in the convent's kitchen late at night, staring at the knives with an expression of longing that had frightened the other sisters. She had been observed making strange marks on her arms with sharp objects, and she had once been caught attempting to feed her infant daughter, a mixture that included what appeared to be her own blood. Most disturbing of all, Margaret had spoken in her sleep, muttering about the hungry ones and the feast that never ends. She had described in horrifying detail the taste of human flesh and the techniques for keeping victims alive while harvesting their bodies. The sisters had initially dismissed these as the ravings of a traumatized mind, but in light of the wayward traveler in Revelations, they now understood that they had been harboring one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Sister Mary Catherine's letter revealed that Margaret Blackwood had not simply been a participant in her husband's cannibalistic enterprise, but had likely been its true architect. The timeline suggested that she had developed her taste for human flesh years before meeting Jeremiah, possibly as a result of her own traumatic experiences as a victim of similar crimes. The deformed child she had given birth to was almost certainly the result of her consumption of human flesh during pregnancy, a practice that had poisoned her own body and that of her unborn child. The letter also provided crucial information about the Blackwoods' final fate. Sister Mary Catherine wrote that Margaret had returned to the convent briefly in the winter of 1876, nearly 2 years after her initial disappearance. She had been traveling with a man who matched Jeremiah Blackwood's description and a young girl who appeared to be about 2 years old. Margaret had seemed desperate, begging the sisters to take in the child and promising to return for her once she had completed her mission. The sisters had reluctantly agreed, and Margaret had departed with her companion, heading west toward the territories. It was the last time anyone at the convent had seen her alive. The child she left behind had been raised by the sisters, given the name Hope in the belief that she might overcome the circumstances of her birth. But the girl had grown up strange and troubled, prone to violent outbursts and an unhealthy fascination with blood and death. Hope had disappeared from the convent on her 16th birthday, leaving behind only a note that read, "I go to find my mother's work and complete what she began. The hungry ones are calling, and I must answer." The sisters had searched for her but found no trace, and they had lived with the fear that she might be continuing the family tradition of horror somewhere in the vast American wilderness. Sheriff Garrett shared Sister Mary Catherine's letter with the federal investigators who had taken over the Wayward Traveler Inn case, and it prompted a new wave of investigation into unsolved disappearances and suspicious deaths across the Western Territories. The possibility that a third generation of Blackwoods might be continuing the family's cannibalistic legacy was too horrifying to ignore. The investigation led to the discovery of several remote locations where evidence suggested that cannibalistic activities had taken place. In the abandoned mine shaft in Nevada, investigators found human bones that had been systematically processed for meat. In a cave system in Colorado, they discovered the remains of a primitive kitchen where human flesh had apparently been prepared and preserved. Most disturbing of all, in a remote cabin in the Oregon wilderness, they found journals written in a hand that matched samples of Margaret Blackwood's writing. These journals, dating from 1876 to 1885, documented Margaret's final years and revealed the full extent of her madness. She wrote of her belief that consuming human flesh was not merely a matter of taste, but a sacred duty, a way of absorbing the life force of her victims and achieving a form of immortality. She described her daughter Hope as her greatest creation, a child born of cannibalistic practices who would carry on the family's mission long after Margaret herself was gone. The journals also revealed that Margaret had not died in the confrontation with Apache warriors, as investigators had previously believed. Instead, she had been killed by her own daughter, who had grown tired of her mother's increasingly erratic behavior and had decided to claim leadership of their cannibalistic enterprise. Hope had poisoned Margaret with a mixture of toxic plants, then had fed her mother's body to the wild animals that served as their disposal system. The final entry in Margaret's journal, written in a hand that was clearly not hers, was signed Hope Blackwood and contained a chilling promise. "The work continues. The hungry ones will never be satisfied, and I will feed them until the end of time. My mother's legacy lives on in me, and through me, it will spread across this land like a plague. No one is safe from the hunger." This discovery prompted the largest manhunt in the history of the American West, as federal marshals, local law enforcement, and even military units searched for Hope Blackwood and any associates she might have recruited. The search continued for months, following leads across multiple states and territories, but Hope seemed to have vanished as completely as her parents had years earlier. The manhunt finally ended in the spring of 1888, when Hope Blackwood's body was discovered in a remote canyon in Utah Territory. She had apparently died of exposure after becoming lost in a blizzard, her body partially consumed by scavengers before being found by a Mormon pioneer family. With her death, the Blackwood line was finally extinguished, and the cannibalistic enterprise that had terrorized the American frontier for more than 15 years was finally brought to an end. But the legacy of the Wayward Traveler Inn extended far beyond the crimes of a single family. The case had revealed the existence of a network of cannibalistic operations that had spread across the frontier like a cancer, feeding on the isolation and lawlessness of the American West. Even after the Blackwoods were gone, investigators continued to uncover evidence of similar operations, some of which had been inspired by the Blackwoods' example and others that had developed independently. The final tally of victims was never definitively established, but conservative estimates suggested that the network had claimed more than 1,000 lives over the course of its existence. The true number was likely much higher, as many victims had been people whose disappearances were never officially reported or investigated. The scope of the horror was so vast that it challenged the ability of the human mind to comprehend it fully. Thomas Henderson lived just long enough to learn of Hope Blackwood's death, passing away peacefully in his sleep just days after receiving the news. His children, Sarah and Michael, had grown into adults who bore the invisible scars of their childhood trauma, but had managed to build meaningful lives despite their horrific experiences. They had both married and had children of their own, determined to create the kind of loving families that they had been denied in their youth. The site of the Wayward Traveler Inn remained abandoned for decades after the building was destroyed, with local residents avoiding the area out of superstition and fear. Eventually, the forest reclaimed the land completely, and today there is no visible sign that the inn ever existed. But hikers and hunters who venture into that remote valley sometimes report feeling an inexplicable sense of dread, as though the very ground remembers the horrors that once took place there. The case of the Wayward Traveler Inn became a turning point in American law enforcement, leading to the establishment of the first federal task force dedicated to investigating crimes that crossed state boundaries. The techniques developed during the investigation became standard practice for dealing with complex criminal enterprises, and the legal precedents established during the trials continued to influence American jurisprudence for generations. More importantly, the case served as a stark reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature, and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would exploit the vulnerable and defenseless. It demonstrated that civilization is a fragile construct that must be constantly defended against those who would tear it down for their own twisted purposes. The story of the Wayward Traveler Inn also highlighted the crucial role that ordinary citizens can play in exposing and stopping criminal enterprises. Without the courage of people like Susan Fletcher, who first raised suspicions about the Blackwoods, and Jacob Stern, who sacrificed his life to help others escape, the horrors might have continued indefinitely. Their example serves as an inspiration to all those who face difficult moral choices, and reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to look the other way when we see something wrong. As we conclude this dark chapter in American history, we must remember that the price of freedom and safety is eternal vigilance. The monsters may change their faces and their methods, but they never truly disappear. They wait in the shadows, looking for opportunities to prey upon the innocent and the vulnerable. It is up to all of us to ensure that they never again find the conditions they need to flourish. The forgotten inn, where strangers paid for their supper with their own flesh, is gone now, consumed by time and nature, like the evil that once festered within its walls. But the memory of what happened there must never be forgotten, for it serves as a warning to future generations about the depths to which human beings can sink when they abandon their moral compass and embrace the darkness that lurks within us all. In remembering the victims of the Wayward Traveler Inn, we honor not only their memory, but also our commitment to ensuring that such horrors never happen again. Their suffering was not in vain if it serves to make us more vigilant, more compassionate, and more determined to protect those who cannot protect themselves. May their souls rest in peace, and may their stories serve as a beacon of warning for all who come after. The hungry ones are silent now, their appetites finally stilled by death and justice, but somewhere in the darkness, new hungers are always stirring, new predators are always searching for prey. It is up to us to ensure that they never find what they are looking for, and that the light of civilization never again falters in the face of such overwhelming darkness. This has been the complete and final account of the Wayward Traveler Inn, where hospitality became horror, and where the very foundations of human decency were tested and nearly destroyed. May we never forget the lessons it teaches us about the price of complacency and the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how difficult or dangerous that stand might be. The story ends here, but the vigilance it demands must never end. For in the shadows of every civilization, the hungry ones are always waiting, and only our constant watchfulness can keep them at bay.